The crack of thunder echoed across the vast Montana plains as rain pelted down mercilessly on Marcus Thompson's weathered pickup truck. Through the blur of his windshield wipers, his headlights caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, thrashing desperately in a pit of thick mud, was a magnificent wild stallion, its powerful body slowly sinking into the earth. That moment would change not just Marcus's life, but would spark a battle that would test the very soul of Silver Creek Valley. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The relentless storm had been battering Silver Creek Valley for 3 straight days, transforming the usually serene Montana landscape into a treacherous maze of muddy terrain and swollen creeks. Marcus Thompson, a third-generation farmer struggling to keep his family's homestead afloat, had spent countless hours reinforcing the barn, moving livestock to higher ground, and praying that his crops wouldn't be completely destroyed by the deluge. At 45, Marcus's face was etched with the kind of weathered determination that came from years of fighting against the elements, against bank loans, and against the ever-present threat of losing everything his grandfather had built. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he made his final rounds of the property, checking for any damage the storm might have caused. The old truck's engine growled in protest as he navigated through the muddy tracks that snaked around his land. It was then, in that moment between lightning flashes, that he saw it. The wild stallion, coat as dark as midnight, was trapped in one of the many mud pits that had formed during the torrential rains. The horse's eyes, wide with terror, reflected the truck's headlights as it fought against the earth that seemed determined to swallow it whole. Marcus's heart pounded in his. He'd heard stories about this horse. The locals called him Shadow Dancer, a legend among the wild herds that roamed the outskirts of Silver Creek Valley. Some claimed he was uncatchable, a ghost that appeared and vanished like the morning mist. Now here he was, this symbol of freedom and power, brought low by nature's cruel twist of fate. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his rope and emergency kit from the truck. The rain stung his face as he carefully approached the pit, his boots sinking inches into the mud with each step. The stallion's panic intensified at his approach, its struggles becoming more violent, threatening to sink it deeper into the treacherous mud. "Easy there, boy," Marcus called out, his voice fighting against the wind. "Easy now. I'm here to help you." The horse's eyes, dark and intelligent, fixed on him with a mix of fear and desperation. Marcus had worked with horses all his life, but there was something different about this one. A wildness, yes, but also a dignity that even in this dire situation seemed undiminished. The mud pit was worse than he'd initially thought. Shadow Dancer was submerged up to his belly, and every movement only seemed to pull him deeper into the earth's greedy embrace. Marcus knew he couldn't do this alone. One wrong move, and both he and the horse could be lost to the mud's suffocating grip. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his cell phone, praying for a signal through the storm. By some miracle, 2 bars appeared, enough to make a call. He dialed the number for his closest neighbor and friend, Jack Wheeler. "Jack, I need your help out on the north pasture," Marcus shouted over the storm. "Got a wild stallion trapped in a mud pit. Bring ropes, boards, anything we can use to get him out. And Jack, hurry!" While waiting for help to arrive, Marcus kept talking to the horse, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos of the storm. He noticed something else about Shadow Dancer, a long scar running down his right flank, evidence that this wasn't the first time the stallion had faced adversity and survived. Through the rain, headlights appeared on the horizon. Jack's truck came bouncing across the field, followed by 2 more vehicles. Word had spread quickly in the small farming community, and others had come to help. Among them was Sarah Martinez, the local veterinarian, her medical kit clutched tightly against her chest as she rushed toward the scene. "Dear God," she breathed, taking in the situation. "He's beautiful." The group worked with the efficiency of people used to facing crises together. Wooden boards were laid around the pit to create a stable working surface. Ropes were carefully positioned around the horse's body, each person taking up a position as Marcus continued to talk to Shadow Dancer, keeping him as calm as possible in the face of so many humans, creatures he'd spent his life avoiding. "On my count," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led men before. 1, 2, 3. The group heaved together, their muscles straining against the mud's hold. Shadow Dancer, as if sensing this was his chance, gathered his remaining strength and pushed with his legs. For a moment nothing happened, and Marcus's heart sank. Then, slowly, inch by inch, the stallion began to rise from the earth's grasp. With a final tremendous effort, Shadow Dancer broke free, stumbling onto the wooden boards. His legs trembled with exhaustion. His magnificent coat caked with mud, but he was alive. The group cheered, their voices carrying across the rain-soaked fields, but their celebration was short-lived. Shadow Dancer's right front leg buckled, and he would have fallen if Marcus hadn't been there to brace him. Sarah moved in quickly, her experienced hands running over the leg. "It's not broken," she announced after a tense examination. "But there's significant soft tissue damage. He'll need care, proper medical attention. He can't survive in the wild like this." Marcus met the stallion's eyes again, seeing in them a mixture of pain, fear, and something else, a fierce will to live. In that moment, he made a decision that would set in motion events he couldn't possibly have foreseen. "We'll take him to my barn," he declared. "Sarah, can you help?" The words had barely left his mouth when a new voice cut through the rain. "That horse belongs to the wild." The group turned to see Richard Kane, owner of the largest ranch in the region, standing at the edge of the gathering. His expensive rain gear and polished boots seemed out of place in the mud and chaos. "He'll die if we leave him," Marcus argued, his hand still steady on Shadow Dancer's neck. Kane's face hardened. "These wild horses are a menace to our grazing lands. Nature's taking care of the problem for us. Leave him." The group fell silent, the only sound the continuing patter of rain and Shadow Dancer's labored breathing. Marcus straightened up, his 6-foot frame rigid with determination. "No," he said simply. Kane's eyes narrowed. "You've got no right to interfere with nature, Thompson. That horse is better off dead than becoming another mouth to feed in this valley." Marcus felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. Richard Kane represented everything that was changing in Silver Creek Valley. The big money, the corporate ranches swallowing up family farms, the disregard for tradition and compassion in favor of profit margins. "Every living thing has a right to fight for its life," Marcus replied, his voice quiet but firm, "and I'm giving him that chance." Kane spat into the mud. "You're a fool, Thompson. Always have been. That's why your farm's failing while my ranch grows. Mark my words, this isn't over." He turned and stalked back to his vehicle, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. The group watched him go, then turned back to the task at hand. With careful coordination, they managed to guide Shadow Dancer into Marcus's horse trailer. The stallion was surprisingly cooperative, as if understanding that these humans, at least, meant him no harm. As Marcus drove slowly back to his barn, Shadow Dancer's massive form swaying gently in the trailer behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something much bigger than simply saving a horse. Richard Kane's threats lingered in his mind, mixing with his concerns about his struggling farm and the uncertain future ahead. But when he glanced in his rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of the magnificent creature he'd helped rescue, Marcus felt a surge of certainty. Whatever came next, he knew he'd made the right choice. Sometimes, he reflected, the measure of a man wasn't in the battles he won, but in the ones he chose to fight. The storm continued to rage across Silver Creek Valley, but in Marcus Thompson's barn, a wild spirit found shelter, and a story of courage, compassion, and defiance began to unfold. As dawn broke over Silver Creek Valley, the first golden rays of sunlight filtered through the weathered slats of Marcus's barn, illuminating the majestic form of Shadow Dancer. The wild stallion stood quietly in the makeshift stall, his mud-caked coat beginning to dry, revealing patches of his true midnight black color. Marcus leaned against the stable door, a steaming cup of coffee warming his hands as he studied his unexpected guest. Sarah Martinez arrived early, her old Jeep kicking up gravel as she pulled into the farmyard. She carried her medical kit and a look of determination that Marcus had come to respect over the years. The veterinarian had a way with animals that went beyond mere medical knowledge. There was an intuitive understanding, a gentle touch that could calm even the most frightened creatures. "How's our patient?" she asked, setting down her kit and pulling on her work gloves. "Didn't sleep much," Marcus replied, opening the stall door. "Kept watching the door, like he was expecting someone to come take his freedom away again." Sarah moved slowly into the stall, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Shadow Dancer's ears flicked forward, remembering her from the previous night's rescue. His intelligent eyes tracked her every move, but he didn't shy away when she reached for his injured leg. "The swelling still significant," she murmured, her skilled hands gently probing the injury. "But there's no heat, which is good news. We'll need to start him on anti-inflammatories, and he'll need at least 6 weeks of rest and rehabilitation." Marcus ran a hand through his graying hair, calculating costs in his head. Times were tough on the farm. The bank had already denied his last loan application, and his equipment was barely holding together. Taking on the care of an injured horse, especially a wild one, wasn't exactly in his budget. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah seemed to read his thoughts. "Marcus, I know things are tight. I can help with the medical supplies, and there's a fund for wildlife rehabilitation that we might be able to tap into." Before Marcus could respond, they heard the rumble of approaching vehicles. Through the barn door, they saw 3 black SUVs pulling up to the farmhouse. Richard Kane stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 men in suits and his ranch. Foreman Mike Dawson. "Here we go," Marcus muttered, squaring his shoulders as he walked out to meet them. Sarah followed, pulling off her gloves with sharp, angry movements. Kane stood in the morning sun, his expensive boots already gathering dust from the farmyard. "Thompson!" he called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a predator sizing up its prey. "We need to talk about that horse." "Nothing to talk about, Kane," Marcus replied, stopping a few feet away. "He's recovering here until he's well enough to return to his herd." Kane's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, there's quite a bit to talk about. These gentlemen are from the Bureau of Land Management. That horse is technically on federal land, and there are regulations about interfering with wildlife." One of the suited men stepped forward, producing a badge and some paperwork. "Mr. Thompson, while your intentions were admirable, you don't have the proper permits or facilities for wildlife rehabilitation. We'll need to take the horse to a licensed facility." "Licensed facility?" Sarah interjected, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You mean one of Kane's holding pens, where wild horses mysteriously disappear?" Kane's face darkened. "Watch your accusations, Dr. Martinez. Everything we do is perfectly legal and documented." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard the stories about Kane's involvement in the controversial wild horse roundups, about healthy horses being shipped off to slaughterhouses under the guise of population control. The thought of Shadow Dancer ending up in one of those pens made his blood boil. "He's injured," Marcus stated firmly. "Moving him now would be dangerous to his recovery. Sarah's a licensed veterinarian, and she's overseeing his care." The second BLM officer cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, if you refuse to comply, we can issue a citation and obtain a court order for removal." As the tension mounted in the farmyard, a commotion arose from the barn. Shadow Dancer had become agitated, perhaps sensing the conflict outside. His powerful hooves struck the stall door, the sound echoing across the morning air like a declaration of defiance. The noise drew everyone's attention, and for a moment, silence fell over the group. In that pause, Marcus heard the approach of more vehicles. Jack Wheeler's truck appeared, followed by several others from the community. Word had spread fast about Kane's arrival. Local farmers and ranchers began stepping out of their vehicles, weather-beaten men and women who had worked this land for generations. They formed a quiet semicircle behind Marcus, a silent show of support that spoke volumes about the community's true heart. Mary Blackhawk, an elder from the nearby reservation, stepped forward. Her presence commanded immediate respect. She was known throughout the valley for her wisdom and her family's deep connection to the land and its horses. "Mr. Kane," she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of generations, "these horses have roamed these lands since before any of us laid claim to them. They are not just animals to be counted and controlled. They are the spirit of this valley, and that spirit cannot be contained by your pens or your paperwork." Kane's confident demeanor faltered slightly in the face of this unexpected opposition. The BLM officers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the growing crowd. Marcus seized the moment. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice steady and determined. "Shadow Dancer stays here until he's healed. Sarah will document everything, file whatever paperwork you need. Once he's recovered, he goes back to his herd, not to a holding facility, not to an auction, but back to freedom where he belongs." The first rays of sunlight caught Shadow Dancer's coat through the barn window, making his black fur gleam like polished onyx. The stallion stood tall despite his injury, his presence a reminder of everything they were fighting for. Not just a single horse, but the very soul of Silver Creek Valley. Kane studied the gathered crowd, calculating his odds. Finally, he adjusted his expensive jacket with a sharp tug. "This isn't over, Thompson. You're playing a dangerous game, and you can't afford to lose." He turned to the BLM officers. "Gentlemen, we'll handle this through proper channels." As Kane and his entourage drove away, leaving clouds of dust in their wake, the community didn't immediately disperse. Instead, they gathered closer, offering support and solutions. Jack Wheeler promised to bring extra hay from his own supplies. Sarah began writing up official documentation for Shadow Dancer's care. Others volunteered time and resources to help with the rehabilitation. Mary Blackhawk approached Marcus as he stood watching Shadow Dancer through the barn door. "You've chosen a difficult path," she said softly, "but it is the right one. That horse—" She paused, studying the stallion with knowing eyes. "He is more than just a wild creature. He is a test of our humanity, of our willingness to stand against the tide of greed and indifference." Marcus nodded, understanding the truth in her words. In saving Shadow Dancer, he had sparked something larger, a stand against the changing times that threatened to erase not just the wild horses, but the very values that had shaped this community. As the morning wore on and people began to leave, each offering words of encouragement and support, Marcus returned to the barn. Shadow Dancer watched him with those intelligent eyes, and Marcus felt a deep connection forming between them, not one of ownership or dominance, but of mutual respect and understanding. "Well, boy," he said softly, reaching out to stroke the stallion's powerful neck, "looks like we're in this together now. Whatever comes next, we'll face it standing, tall." Shadow Dancer lowered his head slightly, letting out a soft snort that seemed almost like agreement. Outside, the morning sun continued to rise over Silver Creek Valley, promising another day of challenges and choices, of battles both small and large, in the name of preserving something precious and wild. In the quiet hours before dawn, Marcus found himself once again in the barn, drawn to the presence of Shadow Dancer. The stallion's recovery had become a daily testament to the resilience of the wild spirit. Each morning brought small victories, the swelling in his leg gradually subsiding, his eyes growing brighter, his movements becoming more fluid despite the confinement of the stall. Sarah's dedication had proven invaluable. She visited daily, bringing not only medical expertise, but also a deep understanding of animal behavior that helped guide their efforts. This morning, she arrived just as Marcus was changing Shadow Dancer's water, her face alight with excitement. "It's time," she declared, setting down her medical bag. "We need to start his rehabilitation exercises. The injury has healed enough that we can begin gentle movement. It'll help prevent muscle atrophy and keep his spirit up." Marcus watched as Sarah demonstrated the exercises, careful stretches and controlled movements designed to strengthen without straining. What amazed him most was Shadow Dancer's willingness to cooperate. The wild stallion, who by all rights should have resisted human contact, seemed to understand they were trying to help. "He's remarkable," Sarah marveled, running her hands along the horse's muscled shoulder. "Most wild horses would take months to develop this level of trust. It's like he knows exactly what we're trying to do." As they worked with Shadow Dancer, Marcus shared his observations from the past weeks. The stallion's personality had begun to emerge, proud but not aggressive, cautious but curious. He had a particular way of expressing himself, using subtle ear movements and soft nickering sounds to communicate his moods. "Watch this," Marcus said, reaching into his pocket for an apple. Shadow Dancer's ears immediately pricked forward, but instead of immediately trying to get the treat, he waited patiently, his eyes fixed on Marcus with an almost human-like understanding. "He's learning our routines," Sarah noted, "but he hasn't lost any of his wild nature. That's crucial for his eventual return to his herd." The mention of release brought a familiar tightness to Marcus's chest. He'd grown attached to Shadow Dancer, more than he cared to admit. The horse's presence had become a bright spot in his daily struggles with the farm's mounting challenges. Their rehabilitation session was interrupted by the arrival of Mary Blackhawk. The elder moved with deliberate grace, carrying a small bundle wrapped in decorated leather. "I brought something," she said, unwrapping the package to reveal dried herbs and what looked like traditional medicine bundles. "These are healing herbs my people have used for generations. They help with both physical and spiritual recovery." Sarah, always open to alternative treatments, watched with interest as Mary explained the properties of each herb. The combination of modern veterinary medicine and traditional healing methods seemed to resonate with Shadow Dancer. He lowered his head, breathing in the aromatic scents with obvious interest. As they worked together, Mary shared stories of her people's connection with horses, speaking of the deep spiritual bond that had existed long before European settlers arrived. Her words painted pictures of a time when horses and humans moved as one across the vast plains, their destinies intertwined. "In our traditions," Mary explained, "horses are seen as bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds. They carry wisdom in their hearts and strength in their spirits. When we help them, we help ourselves." The morning's quiet work was suddenly interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. Marcus's heart sank as he recognized Mike Dawson's truck, Kane's foreman, pulling up to the farm with several other vehicles in tow. "More trouble," Sarah muttered, but Mary raised a calming hand. "Wait," she said softly. "Not all confrontations are what they appear to be." To everyone's surprise, Mike Dawson emerged from his truck looking troubled rather than threatening. Behind him, several ranch hands from Kane's property shuffled uncomfortably, their usual bravado notably absent. "Thompson!" Mike called out, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "We need to talk. It's about Kane's plans for the wild herds." Inside the barn, they gathered around an old wooden table as Mike revealed what had brought him there. Kane had been secretly preparing for a massive roundup of the wild horse herds, planning to clear them from the valley permanently. The permits were already in process, and Kane had hired a notorious contractor known for brutal handling methods. "I've worked for Kane for 15 years, Mike said, his weathered face lined with concern. "But this isn't right. These horses belong here. They're part of what makes this valley special. Kane doesn't see it. He only sees dollar signs and grazing rights." The news hit Marcus like a physical blow. Shadow Dancer's herd, the very family they were preparing to return him to, could be gone before he was fully healed. The thought of all those magnificent creatures being captured, separated, and possibly sent to slaughter was unbearable. "We need proof," Sarah said firmly. "Something concrete we can take to the authorities." Mike nodded, pulling out his phone. "That's why we're here. We've been gathering evidence, photos, videos, documentation of Kane's illegal practices. But we need help to stop him. We need the community to stand together." As they discussed strategy, Shadow Dancer stood quietly in his stall, his ears forward, almost as if he was listening and understanding the gravity of the situation. His presence served as a powerful reminder of what they were fighting to protect. Mary Blackhawk spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of generations. This valley has always been a place of balance between wild and tame, between progress and preservation. Cain seeks to destroy that balance for his own gain. We cannot let that happen. The group spent hours planning, drawing on each person's strengths and connections. Sarah's medical documentation of Shadow Dancer's recovery would help prove the value of rehabilitation over capture. Mary's traditional knowledge and standing in the community would lend crucial cultural legitimacy to their cause. Mike and his men could provide insider testimony about Cain's illegal practices. As the discussion continued, Marcus noticed something remarkable. Shadow Dancer had begun moving in his stall, performing the rehabilitation exercises on his own, as if demonstrating his determination to heal and return to his herd. The sight brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Look at him," she whispered. "He's not just surviving. He's fighting to get back to where he belongs. We have to make sure he has a home to return to." The group's planning was interrupted by the arrival of Jack Wheeler, who burst into the barn with news that would change everything. "Cain's men are already setting up trap lines on the North Ridge," he reported breathlessly. "They're starting the roundup early, tomorrow at dawn." The news galvanized the group into action. Phone calls were made, messages sent, and within hours, word had spread throughout the valley. Farmers, ranchers, tribal members, and townspeople began arriving at Marcus's farm, drawn together by the urgent need to protect something precious and irreplaceable. As the sun began to set, Marcus stood with Shadow Dancer, drawing strength from the stallion's quiet presence. The horse's recovery had become more than just a mission of mercy. It had evolved into a symbol of resistance against the forces threatening to destroy the wild beauty of Silver Creek Valley. "We've got a fight ahead of us, boy," Marcus murmured, stroking Shadow Dancer's neck. The stallion responded with a soft nicker, pressing his head against Marcus's chest in a gesture that felt like both comfort and encouragement. Outside, the community continued to gather, bringing food, supplies, and most importantly, their unwavering determination to stand against Cain's plans. As darkness fell over the valley, lights began to appear. Headlights, lanterns, and flashlights, creating a constellation of hope in the gathering night. Mary Blackhawk approached Marcus one last time before heading home to prepare for the next day's confrontation. "You know," she said, her eyes twinkling with wisdom, "sometimes it takes one act of kindness to awaken the conscience of an entire community. By saving Shadow Dancer, you've reminded everyone of what we stand to lose if we remain silent." Marcus nodded, understanding that tomorrow would bring either triumph or heartbreak. But looking at the gathered community, he felt a surge of hope. Together, they had a chance to preserve something precious, not just the wild horses, but the very soul of Silver Creek Valley. As the night deepened, Shadow Dancer stood tall in his stall, his presence a reminder of the untamed spirit they were fighting to protect. Tomorrow would test their resolve, but tonight, in this barn, surrounded by people united in purpose, Marcus knew they had already won something invaluable, the recognition that some things were worth any sacrifice to preserve. The first hints of dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when Marcus's farm burst into activity. Trucks and cars filled the property, their headlights cutting through the pre-morning darkness like beacons of hope. People moved with quiet determination, carrying supplies, setting up communications, and preparing for what everyone knew would be a decisive confrontation. Sarah arrived early, her medical kit supplemented with additional supplies donated by supporters from neighboring towns. She immediately went to check on Shadow Dancer, whose remarkable progress had become a source of inspiration for everyone involved in the fight against Kane's roundup plans. "Look at this," she called to Marcus, pointing to Shadow Dancer's injured leg. "The swelling's almost completely gone. He's healing faster than I could have imagined." The stallion stood proudly in his stall, his coat gleaming with health, his eyes bright with intelligence and strength. Jack Wheeler had organized a network of spotters positioned throughout the valley, equipped with radios and binoculars. They would track Kane's movements and coordinate their response. Mary Blackhawk had brought members of her tribe, their deep knowledge of the land and its hidden paths proving invaluable to their strategy. Marcus gathered everyone in the barn for a final briefing. The space was packed with faces both familiar and new. Farmers, ranchers, tribal members, townspeople, even some of Kane's former employees who had chosen to stand with them. The atmosphere was charged with nervous energy and determination. "Kane's men will begin at sunrise," Marcus explained, pointing to a roughly drawn map of the valley. "They'll try to drive the herds into these narrow canyons where they've set up their trap lines. Our job is to prevent that from happening without breaking any laws." Mike Dawson, now fully committed to their cause, added his insider knowledge. "Kane's hired some real rough characters for this roundup. They won't hesitate to use aggressive tactics. We need to stay calm and document everything." Sarah stepped forward, holding up her phone. "I've contacted every media outlet within 100 miles. We've got reporters on the way. Kane might be able to buy off local officials, but he can't silence the press." As the group discussed final details, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the barn doors, they could see dust clouds rising on the distant ridges. Kane's operation was beginning ahead of schedule. The radio crackled with reports from their spotters. "They're moving in from the north and east," Jack's voice came through. "At least 20 riders. They've got helicopters, too." Marcus felt his heart race, but kept his voice steady. "All right. Everyone knows their positions. Remember, we're here to protect these horses, but we have to do it legally. Document everything. Stay peaceful, but firm." As the group began to disperse to their assigned locations, Shadow Dancer suddenly let out a powerful neigh that echoed through the barn. The sound stopped everyone in their tracks. The stallion stood at attention, his ears forward, as if sensing the approach of his herd. Mary Blackhawk touched Marcus's arm. "He knows," she said softly. "He understands what's at stake." The next hours unfolded like scenes from an epic western, but this was no movie. This was a real fight for the soul of the land. Kane's riders approached the wild herds aggressively, but at every turn they found themselves blocked by groups of peaceful protesters. Cameras recorded every moment, every attempt to push through, every aggressive move. Marcus coordinated from his truck, moving between different locations, offering support and guidance where needed. The sight of the wild horses running free, their manes flying in the wind, strengthened everyone's resolve. These weren't just animals to be captured and sold. They were living symbols of the American West, of freedom itself. The situation reached a critical point at Thunder Canyon, where Kane's men had set up their main trapline. As they tried to drive a large herd toward the metal corrals, they found the path blocked by a line of vehicles and protesters. Kane himself arrived by helicopter, his face dark with fury as he surveyed the scene. "This is private property," he shouted, storming toward Marcus. "You're interfering with a legal operation." "Actually," Sarah stepped forward, holding up official documents, "this is public land, Mr. Kane. We have every right to be here, and we have documentation of multiple violations of federal wildlife protection laws by your operation." The arrival of news vans and reporters added another layer of tension to the scene. Cameras rolled as Kane's hired hands grew increasingly aggressive, trying to push through the protesters. But the community held firm, their unity proving stronger than any attempt at intimidation. As the morning wore on, more supporters arrived, including environmental activists and wildlife photographers who had heard about the standoff through social media. The story was spreading, drawing attention to their cause in ways Kane hadn't anticipated. In a dramatic moment, one of Kane's helicopters flew too low over the herd, spooking the horses. Instead of running toward the trap lines as planned, the magnificent animals wheeled away, led by a powerful stallion that Marcus recognized as Shadow Dancer's former rival for leadership of the herd. Kane's frustration boiled over. "You're destroying everything I've built," he shouted at Marcus. "These horses are nothing but pests, eating grass that could feed profitable cattle." Marcus stood his ground, his voice carrying across the canyon. "These horses are part of our heritage, Kane. They belong to all of us and to none of us. They're not just animals to be bought and sold. They're living symbols of everything that makes this land special." The confrontation might have turned ugly, but at that moment, federal agents arrived, real ones this time, not Kane's paid bureaucrats. They had been contacted by Sarah and provided with evidence of multiple violations of wildlife protection laws. As the agents began questioning Kane and his men, examining permits and documentation, the community's victory became apparent. The roundup was suspended pending investigation, and Kane's operations would face serious scrutiny. Back at Marcus's farm that evening, the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that their fight wasn't over. Kane's influence ran deep, and there would be other battles ahead. But something fundamental had changed in Silver Creek Valley. The community had found its voice and its courage. Shadow Dancer stood at his stall door, watching the gathering with those intelligent eyes. His rehabilitation was nearly complete, and soon he would return to his herd. But his legacy would live on in the unity he had inspired. Mary Blackhawk gathered everyone around as the sun set, her voice carrying ancient wisdom. "Today, we didn't just save horses," she said. "We saved something inside ourselves, the part that knows right from wrong, the part that's willing to stand up for what we believe in, no matter the cost." Marcus stood with Sarah, watching the community share food and stories, strengthening the bonds that had been forged in adversity. Children played nearby, their laughter mixing with the soft sounds of horses in the barn. "You know," Sarah said quietly, "when you first pulled Shadow Dancer from that mud pit, I thought you were just saving one horse, but you were really saving all of us, reminding us of who we are and what we stand for." Marcus smiled, thinking of how far they'd come. The farm's financial struggles weren't over, but somehow they seemed less daunting now. The community that had come together to save the wild horses wouldn't let one of their own fail. As night fell over Silver Creek Valley, Shadow Dancer's occasional nickering could be heard from the barn, a sound that had become synonymous with hope and resilience. The wild spirit that had brought them together would continue to inspire and guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new opportunities to stand up for what they believed in. But tonight, under the vast Montana sky, they celebrated not just a victory over greed and exploitation, but the rediscovery of their own strength when they stood together for something greater than themselves. The story of Shadow Dancer and the community that fought to protect his kind would be told for generations, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of courage start with a single moment of compassion, and that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the bonds we forge and the principles we uphold. In the weeks following the confrontation with Cain, Silver Creek Valley underwent a transformation that went far beyond the preservation of its wild horses. The community's victory had awakened something powerful, a renewed sense of purpose and connection that touched every aspect of life in the valley. Marcus spent his mornings with Shadow Dancer, whose recovery had progressed remarkably. The stallion moved with increasing confidence, his injured leg showing barely a trace of the weakness that had once threatened his survival. But it wasn't just his physical healing that amazed everyone. It was the way he had become a bridge between the wild and domestic worlds. One crisp morning, as Marcus entered the barn, he found Sarah already there, but she wasn't alone. A group of children from the local school stood in a semicircle around Shadow Dancer's stall, their faces filled with wonder as Sarah explained the horse's remarkable journey. "Can he understand us?" a small girl asked, her eyes wide as Shadow Dancer lowered his head to her level. "In his own way," Sarah replied, smiling. "Horses are incredibly intelligent and sensitive creatures. They can read our emotions and intentions better than we sometimes realize." The educational programs had been Sarah's idea, using Shadow Dancer's story to teach children about wildlife conservation, compassion, and the importance of standing up for what they believed in. The stallion seemed to embrace his role as ambassador, showing remarkable patience with his young visitors. But education wasn't the only change sweeping through Silver Creek Valley. The publicity from their stand against Cain had drawn attention to the region's wild horse population, leading to unexpected opportunities. Wildlife photographers and documentary filmmakers began arriving, hoping to capture the majestic herds in their natural habitat. Mary Blackhawk and her tribe had started, offering cultural tours, sharing their traditional knowledge about the horses and the land. The programs brought sustainable tourism to the valley, providing new income sources for struggling families while promoting conservation. "See how one act of kindness ripples outward," Mary observed to Marcus as they watched a group of visitors, eagerly listening to tribal stories. "By saving Shadow Dancer, you started something much bigger than yourself." The changes weren't limited to tourism. Local ranchers, inspired by the community's unity, began exploring more sustainable grazing practices that could coexist with the wild horse populations. Jack Wheeler had started a cooperative program, sharing resources and knowledge to help smaller farms survive and thrive. Even Cain's former employees, led by Mike Dawson, were part of the transformation. They'd established a monitoring program to protect the wild herds, using their skills and knowledge of the land for conservation rather than capture. One afternoon, as Marcus worked on repairing his old tractor, a familiar but unexpected visitor arrived. Thomas Cain, Richard's teenage son, walked hesitantly into the farmyard. The boy looked uncomfortable in his expensive clothes, so different from his father's confident swagger. "Mr. Thompson?" Thomas called out. Can I Can I see him? The horse you saved?" Marcus studied the boy for a moment, seeing something in his eyes that reminded him more of the wild horses than of Richard Kane. "Come on," he said, leading the way to the barn. Shadow Dancer watched them approach, his ears forward with interest. Thomas stood transfixed, reaching out slowly to touch the stallion's nose. "Dad says they're just animals," Thomas said quietly, "that everything has a price tag. But that's not true, is it? Some things are worth more than money." "Your father measures worth in dollars and cents," Marcus replied, watching the connection forming between boy and horse. "But there are other ways to be rich." That visit marked another subtle but significant change in the valley. Thomas began spending more time at the farm, learning about horses and the land from people who saw them as more than commodities. It was a small crack in the foundation of Kane's influence, but sometimes that's all change needed to take root. The legal battles weren't over. Kane's lawyers continued to file challenges and appeals, but the community had learned to stand together. When Marcus worried about legal fees, he'd find anonymous donations in his mailbox. When he needed extra hands for farm work, volunteers would appear without being asked. Sarah's documentation of Shadow Dancer's rehabilitation had gained attention in veterinary circles, leading to a grant for establishing a proper wildlife rehabilitation center in the valley. The facility would serve not just horses, but all native wildlife, providing care and hope for injured animals while creating jobs for local residents. "You've started a revolution of kindness," Sarah told Marcus one evening as they watched Shadow Dancer exercise in the paddock. The stallion moved, with the fluid grace of a fully recovered athlete, but he chose to stay close to them, showing no desire to escape. "He'll need to return to his herd soon," Marcus said, his voice carrying a hint of sadness. They had all grown attached to Shadow Dancer, but they knew his true place was with his own kind. The decision about Shadow Dancer's release sparked intense discussion within the community. Mary Blackhawk advocated for a traditional ceremony to mark his return to the wild. The school children wanted to say goodbye to their equine teacher. Even Thomas Kane asked to be present for the release. As preparations for Shadow Dancer's return to freedom began, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that stormy night, when he'd found the stallion trapped in mud. The struggling farmer who'd acted on impulse to save one horse had discovered a deeper truth about community, courage, and the connections that give life its real value. One morning, as dawn painted the sky in spectacular colors, Marcus entered the barn to find Shadow Dancer standing alertly, his ears pricked toward the distant hills. The sound of wild horses could be heard. Shadow Dancer's herd was passing through the valley below. Sarah arrived moments later, immediately understanding the significance of the moment. "It's time," she said softly, her eyes glistening with tears. "He's ready, and they're here." The news spread quickly through the community. People began arriving at the farm, gathering quietly to witness this moment of transition. Mary Blackhawk brought sacred herbs to bless the journey. The school children made hand-drawn cards expressing their gratitude and love for their equine friend. As they prepared to open the gates that would allow Shadow Dancer to return to his herd, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion. This wasn't an ending, but a continuation. The wild spirit that had touched their lives would remain free, inspiring future generations to protect and preserve the untamed beauty of their land. Thomas Kane stood among the gathered crowd, his presence a quiet rebellion against his father's values. The boy's face showed understanding beyond his years as he watched Shadow Dancer's final moments in captivity. "Sometimes," Thomas said, echoing Marcus's words from their first meeting, "the richest things in life are the ones you set free." The morning sun had fully risen when they finally opened the gates. Shadow Dancer stepped forward carefully, his head high, nostrils flaring as he scented his herd. He paused at the threshold of his freedom, turning back to look at the humans who had become his temporary family. In that moment, Marcus understood that some bonds transcend the barriers between wild and tame. Shadow Dancer had taught them all that freedom and connection could coexist, that strength could be found in gentleness, and that the mightiest changes often begin with simple acts of compassion. The stallion gave one last quiet nicker, then turned and trotted toward his waiting herd. His powerful strides showed no trace of his former injury as he moved across the landscape he had been born to roam. The watching crowd remained silent, sharing in the beauty and bittersweetness of the moment. As Shadow Dancer disappeared over the ridge with his herd, Marcus felt Sarah's hand slip into his. The touch carried understanding and hope, understanding of what they had accomplished together and hope for what was yet to come. Silver Creek Valley had been transformed, not by grand schemes or corporate investments, but by the pure spirit of a wild horse and the courage of people who dared to believe in something greater than themselves. The legacy of their stand against greed and exploitation would live on in the thundering hooves of free-running horses and the united heart of a community that had rediscovered its soul. The seasons turned in Silver Creek Valley, bringing changes that rippled through the community like waves across a prairie sea. 6 months had passed since Shadow Dancer's return to the wild, and his influence continued to shape the valley in unexpected ways. The rehabilitation center that Sarah had established was thriving, becoming a beacon of hope for injured wildlife throughout the region. Marcus stood at his farmhouse porch one autumn morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold. The sound of approaching vehicles drew his attention, but unlike the tense confrontations of the past, these arrivals brought excitement and purpose. A group of university researchers had come to study the valley's unique approach to wildlife. Conservation, what had started as Shadow Dancer's story, had evolved into a model for community-based environmental stewardship that was drawing attention from across the country. "The data is remarkable," Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead researcher, explained as she spread charts across Marcus's kitchen table. "The wild horse populations are stabilizing naturally. The grasslands are healthier than they've been in decades, and the local economy is actually growing. You've achieved something that most experts thought impossible." The success hadn't come easily. Kane's influence still cast shadows over the valley, but his power had been significantly diminished. The investigation into his illegal practices had revealed a web of corruption that reached far beyond wild horse roundups. Thomas, his son, had become a regular visitor to the rehabilitation center, much to his father's dismay. "Dad doesn't understand," Thomas confided to Marcus one afternoon while helping with the daily chores. "He thinks power comes from controlling things, but I've learned there's more strength in protecting what's valuable than in trying to own it." The rehabilitation center had become more than just a place for healing injured animals, Under Sarah's guidance, it had evolved into an educational hub where traditional knowledge met modern veterinary science. Mary Blackhawk's wisdom complemented Sarah's medical expertise, creating a unique approach to wildlife care that honored both science and spirit. One morning, as Sarah treated a young eagle with an injured wing, she shared her observations with a group of visiting veterinary students. "What we've learned here goes beyond medical treatment," she explained. "It's about understanding that healing happens in many ways. Through medicine, yes, but also through community, through respect for the wild spirit, and through the connection between all living things." The changes in Silver Creek Valley had begun to attract attention from other communities facing similar challenges. Delegations would visit, hoping to learn how to balance progress with preservation, how to unite divided communities around a common cause. Jack Wheeler had become an unexpected ambassador for their cause, traveling to neighboring valleys to share their story. "It's not just about the horses," he would tell his audiences. "It's about remembering who we are and what we stand for. When we saved those horses, we saved something in ourselves too." The transformation wasn't limited to wildlife conservation. The valley's farms were experiencing a renaissance, adopting sustainable practices that worked in harmony with the natural environment. The cooperative programs that had emerged during their stand against cane had evolved into permanent arrangements, helping small farmers survive and thrive. One particularly meaningful change came in the form of a youth program inspired by Thomas Kane's experience. Young people from across the region would come to learn about wildlife, conservation, and the importance of standing up for their beliefs. Many were from troubled backgrounds, finding healing and purpose through their connection with the animals. Marcus watched these changes with quiet satisfaction, but his thoughts often turned to Shadow Dancer. They would occasionally spot the stallion with his herd, his black coat gleaming in the sunlight as he led his family across the valley's vast expanses. He seemed to have grown even more magnificent in his return to freedom, a living symbol of the wild spirit they had fought to protect. One crisp autumn morning, an unexpected visitor arrived at the farm. Angela Kane, Richard's wife, stepped out of her luxury SUV, looking somewhat out of place, but determined. Marcus had never spoken with her before, though he'd seen her at various social functions in town. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice carrying a hint of uncertainty, "I wanted to thank you, not just for what you've done for the valley, but for what you've done for my son. Thomas has changed in the best possible way." Their conversation revealed another layer of impact that Shadow Dancer's story had created. Angela spoke of how the experience had opened her eyes to what was truly important, how she had begun to question the values that had shaped their family's life. "Richard is struggling," she admitted, "but he's beginning to see that his way isn't the only way. Thomas talks about the work you're doing here, about the horses, about community. It's making us all think differently." The rehabilitation center continued to evolve, expanding its scope beyond injured wildlife. They began offering programs for veterans suffering from PTSD, providing a peaceful environment where healing could occur through connection with animals and nature. One such veteran, James Cooper, found particular solace in working with the horses. "Out here," he explained to Marcus, "everything makes sense again. These animals don't care about your past or your struggles. They just respond to who you are in the moment, to the peace and patience you bring to them." The valley's transformation had even begun to influence local politics. The community's successful stand against corporate interests had inspired others to become more involved in local government, ensuring that decisions about land use and development would reflect the values they had fought to protect. Mary Blackhawk's cultural tours had expanded into a full educational program, teaching visitors about the deep connection between the land, its wildlife, and its people. Her wisdom helped bridge the gap between different perspectives, showing how traditional knowledge could inform modern conservation efforts. "The circle is complete," she told Marcus one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Shadow Dancer came to us injured, and in healing him, we healed ourselves. Now his spirit continues to heal others." The story of Silver Creek Valley's transformation began to spread beyond their region, carried by visitors who had witnessed their success and by media outlets interested in positive examples of community-driven change. Environmental organizations studied their model, looking for ways to replicate their achievements in other areas facing similar challenges. One day, as Marcus worked in the rehabilitation center's new extension, he found Thomas Kane studying the photo wall they had created. The images told the story of their journey: Shadow Dancer trapped in the mud, his recovery, the community's stand against the roundup, and finally his return to freedom. "You know what I've learned from all this?" Thomas said thoughtfully. "It's not about choosing between progress and preservation. It's about finding a way forward that respects both. Dad always said you had to be tough to succeed, but now I see that true strength comes from being able to care." The young man's words captured the essence of what they had achieved. Silver Creek Valley had become a living example of how communities could thrive by choosing cooperation over conflict, preservation over exploitation, and hope over fear. As another day drew to a close, Marcus stood at his farmhouse porch, listening to the distant sounds of wild horses moving across the valley. The rehabilitation center's lights glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, a beacon of hope in the landscape they had fought to protect. Sarah joined him, having finished her evening rounds. "Sometimes I think about that night in the storm," she said softly. "How different everything would be if you hadn't stopped to help one trapped horse." Marcus nodded, understanding that the true measure of their success wasn't just in the animals they had saved or the battles they had won, but in the way their community had rediscovered its heart and purpose. Shadow Dancer's legacy lived on in every person who found healing in their work, every young person who learned to stand up for their beliefs, and every wild creature that roamed freely across their protected lands. The light faded from the sky, but the spirit of hope and renewal that had transformed Silver Creek Valley continued to shine brightly, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between all living things. A thunderstorm was brewing over Silver Creek Valley, reminiscent of the fateful night when Marcus had first found Shadow Dancer. But this time, the dark clouds brought not despair, but anticipation. Word had spread through the community's network. A group of wild horses had been spotted moving unusually close to populated areas, seemingly pushed out of their traditional grounds. Marcus received the call just before sunset. Mike Dawson's voice crackled with urgency over the phone. "You need to see this, Thompson. Something's forced the herds to move. They're scared, and Shadow Dancer's leading them." Within minutes, Marcus was in his truck with Sarah, racing toward the eastern boundary of the valley. The rehabilitation center's emergency response team followed close behind, ready for any situation they might encounter. The rain began to fall. As they reached the ridge overlooking Shadow Creek, what they saw stopped them in their tracks. A large herd of wild horses, at least 60 strong, moved through the valley below. At their head was an unmistakable figure. Shadow Dancer, his black coat gleaming even in the dim stormlight. But something was wrong. The herd's movement was erratic, panicked. "Look there!" Sarah pointed toward the distant tree line. Through the rain they could make out the shapes of heavy machinery, bulldozers and earth movers. The sound of chainsaws echoed through the valley. Kane Properties Development, Mike spat the words as he joined them at the ridge. They're clearing land for that resort project they've been pushing. Must have started early to avoid the protesters. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. The development project would cut straight through the wild horses' traditional grazing grounds and migration routes. Kane had found a new way to attack what they had fought to protect. But as they watched the scene unfold, something unexpected happened. Shadow Dancer, instead of leading his herd away from the disturbance, turned them toward Marcus's property. It was as if the stallion remembered the sanctuary he had once found there. "He's bringing them to us," Sarah whispered, amazement in her voice. "He remembers." The next hours became a testament to everything the community had built since Shadow Dancer's rescue. The emergency response network sprang into action. Jack Wheeler organized his cooperative farmers to open their pastures. Mary Blackhawk arrived with tribal elders, their knowledge of the land crucial for understanding the herd's needs. As the storm intensified, the wild horses gathered in the valley below Marcus's farm. Shadow Dancer moved among them, his presence seeming to calm the more nervous animals. The sight of him, now a powerful herd leader, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Look how far he's come," she said, watching him guide a young foal to shelter. From fighting for his own survival to protecting others. The development crews had stopped work due to the storm, giving the community precious time to organize their response. Thomas Kane arrived, soaked to the skin but determined to help. His inside knowledge of his father's plans proved invaluable. "The resort project is just the beginning," he revealed as they gathered in Marcus's barn. "Dad's partnered with a major development corporation. They want to turn the entire valley into a luxury playground." The news hit hard, but the community had learned how to face challenges together. Dr. Rodriguez, who happened to be visiting for her research, immediately began documenting the impact on wildlife patterns. Her evidence would be crucial for the legal battles ahead. As night fell, the storm reached its peak. The wild horses huddled together in the sheltered valleys, while volunteers worked tirelessly to ensure their safety. Shadow Dancer remained, visible throughout the night, moving between groups, keeping watch over his extended family. Marcus found himself working alongside people from all walks of life: ranchers, environmentalists, tribal members, even former opponents who had come to understand the importance of preserving the valley's wild heritage. The spirit of unity that Shadow Dancer had inspired continued to grow stronger. Mary Blackhawk worked with Sarah to coordinate care for any horses showing signs of stress or injury from their forced relocation. Their combined approach, blending traditional wisdom with modern veterinary science, proved remarkably effective. "The land remembers," Mary said as they worked. "And so do its creatures. Shadow Dancer is showing us the way." When we're threatened, we come together. When we're lost, we seek those who once helped us. The night's events became a turning point in Silver Creek Valley's ongoing transformation. The immediate crisis of protecting the displaced herds evolved into a larger movement to secure the valley's future. The community began planning for permanent wildlife corridors, protected grazing lands, and sustainable development that would benefit both humans and animals. Thomas Kane's role grew increasingly important. His understanding of corporate development strategies helped them anticipate and counter his father's moves. More than that, his personal journey from privileged heir to environmental advocate inspired others to question their assumptions about progress and prosperity. "We don't have to choose between development and preservation," he argued during a community meeting. "The real value of this valley isn't in luxury resorts or golf courses. It's in its wild spirit, in the way it brings people together, in the hope it represents." The rehabilitation center became the hub of their expanded efforts. Sarah's program had already proven that healing happened best when people and animals worked together. Now they began developing new initiatives: wildlife monitoring systems, educational programs, and cooperative land management strategies that would protect the valley's essential character while allowing for sustainable growth. As dawn approached, the storm began to ease. Marcus stood with Sarah at the ridge, watching Shadow Dancer lead small groups of horses to drink from the creek. The stallion's presence was both powerful and gentle, a reminder of how far they had all come from that first desperate night of rescue. "He's not just surviving anymore," Sarah observed. "He's thriving, leading, showing others the way, just like we all have to do." The morning light revealed the extent of the community's response. Pastures had been opened, shelters prepared, and support systems activated. What could have been a disaster had become a demonstration of their strength and unity. Jack Wheeler's cooperative farmers had already begun adapting their grazing rotation plans to accommodate the displaced herds. The tribal council, led by Mary Blackhawk, was mapping traditional migration routes that could be protected and restored. Dr. Rodriguez saw in their response a model for other communities facing similar challenges. "What you've built here goes beyond wildlife conservation," she told Marcus. "You've created a new way of thinking about community, about progress, about what really matters." Or the next weeks brought both challenges and opportunities. Kane's development plans faced increased scrutiny as evidence of environmental impact mounted. The media attention that followed helped spread their message of balanced development and conservation. But the real story was in the daily victories, the way former adversaries worked together, the healing that happened when people connected with the land and its creatures, the hope that grew stronger with each small success. Shadow Dancer remained a visible presence in the valley, his herd integrating with others displaced by the development. His example of leadership and adaptation inspired everyone who witnessed it. The stallion, who had once needed saving, had become a savior himself, showing how resilience and compassion could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. One evening, as the community gathered to celebrate their latest victory, a court injunction against the resort development, Marcus found himself sharing Shadow Dancer's story with a group of visiting journalists. But he realized the story had grown far beyond one horse's rescue and recovery. "It's about remembering who we are," he told them, gesturing to the diverse group of people working together around them. "About recognizing that true strength comes from protecting what's valuable, not exploiting it. about understanding that when we save something wild and free, we save something in ourselves too. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors. A shadow dancer led his herd to their evening grazing grounds. The sight of wild horses moving freely across the landscape, protected by a community united in purpose, spoke more eloquently than any words about the power of compassion to transform lives and heal the rifts between people and the natural world. The legacy of that stormy night, when Marcus had first found Shadow Dancer, continued to grow, touching more lives and inspiring more positive change than anyone could have imagined. In saving one horse, they had started a movement that would ensure the wild spirit of Silver Creek Valley would endure for generations to come. The golden light of early morning filtered through the autumn leaves as Marcus stood at the edge of his property, surveying the valley below. A year had passed since Shadow Dancer had led the displaced herds to safety, and the landscape had undergone a remarkable transformation. Where Kane's bulldozers had once threatened to destroy ancient grazing grounds, protected wildlife corridors now ensured safe passage for the wild horses and other creatures that called Silver Creek Valley home. Sarah's truck pulled up beside him, dust settling around its wheels as she stepped out with a stack of papers in her hand. Her face bore an expression of triumph that immediately caught Marcus's attention. "It's official," she announced, holding up the documents. "The Silver Creek Wildlife Trust has been approved. The entire eastern section of the valley is now permanently protected land." The news represented months of tireless work by the entire community. They had raised funds, gathered signatures, and built a coalition of support that stretched far beyond their valley. But the true catalyst for this victory had come from an unexpected source. Thomas Kane had become the Trust's most powerful advocate, using his father's own business connections to secure crucial backing. The young man's passionate speeches about preserving wild spaces had swayed corporate boards and environmental organizations alike. "My father taught me that everything has a price," Thomas had told a group of investors, but he was wrong. Some things are priceless, like the sight of wild horses running free, like the knowledge that we've protected something pure and untamed for future generations. The rehabilitation center had evolved into a world-renowned facility, drawing visitors and researchers from across the globe. Sarah's innovative approach, combining modern veterinary science with traditional healing practices, had revolutionized wildlife care. Mary Blackhawk's wisdom had become an integral part of their success, proving that ancient knowledge and modern methods could work in harmony. As if summoned by their conversation, a distant drumming of hooves drew their attention. A herd of wild horses appeared on the horizon, moving with the fluid grace that never failed to take Marcus's breath away. At their head, Shadow Dancer's powerful form was unmistakable. "Look at him," Sarah breathed, watching the stallion guide his family across the landscape he had helped protect. "He's not just a survivor anymore. He's a symbol of everything we fought for." The herd's presence had attracted a small group of observers. Dr. Rodriguez's research team was documenting their movements, while a class from the new Environmental Education Center watched in awe. Among them was Angela Kane, who had become one of their most dedicated supporters after witnessing the positive changes in her son. "I never understood before," Angela confided to Marcus as they watched the horses. "Richard always said we had to control nature to profit from it. But there's more profit in preservation than he ever imagined, not just in money, but in spirit. The valley's transformation had rippled out in unexpected ways. Local businesses had adapted to embrace sustainable tourism, offering guided wildlife tours and educational experiences. The cooperative farming network had expanded, proving that traditional agriculture could thrive alongside wildlife conservation. Jack Wheeler's voice crackled over the radio, interrupting their reflections. "Marcus, you might want to head up to Sunrise Ridge. There's something you need to see." Intrigued, Marcus and Sarah drove to the ridge overlooking the valley's western edge. They found Jack standing with Mary Blackhawk, both watching an extraordinary scene unfold below. Shadow Dancer's herd had encountered another group of wild horses. Led by a young stallion, Marcus recognized as one of the first foals born after the establishment of the protected corridor. Instead of the territorial confrontation they might have expected, they witnessed something remarkable. Shadow Dancer approached the younger stallion with an almost ceremonial dignity. The two horses moved in parallel, their herds gradually merging in a display of natural cooperation that left the observers speechless. "The old ways are returning," Mary said softly. "The horses remember what we forgot, that strength lies in unity, not division." The sight inspired a new initiative at the rehabilitation center. Sarah began documenting how recovered animals reintegrated with wild populations, while Mary Blackhawk shared stories of how her people had once lived in harmony with the great horse herds. Their work caught the attention of a major conservation organization, leading to a partnership that would help protect wild horses across the American West. Silver Creek Valley became a model for how communities could balance progress with preservation. Thomas Kane's transformation continued to influence others. He had started a youth leadership program, teaching young people about environmental stewardship and community activism. Many of his students came from wealthy families like his own, but they left with a new understanding of true value. "Every time I see Shadow Dancer," Thomas told his students, "I remember that real power isn't about controlling things. It's about protecting what matters." The rehabilitation center's success had sparked another unexpected development. Veterans, finding healing through work with the horses, had started a program of their own, helping other trauma survivors reconnect with life through animal care. James Cooper, once a quiet presence at the center, had become a leading voice in wildlife rehabilitation therapy. "These horses," James explained to a group of fellow veterans, "they don't judge us for our scars. They show us how to be strong without being hard, how to heal without forgetting who we are." As winter approached, the community faced a new challenge. Climate change had begun affecting the valley's weather patterns, threatening both wildlife and agriculture. But instead of despairing, they adapted, drawing on their experience of working together to find innovative solutions. The cooperative farming network, led by Jack Wheeler, began implementing sustainable practices that would help both domestic and wild animals survive increasingly extreme weather. Mary Blackhawk's traditional knowledge proved invaluable in understanding how the landscape had adapted to changes in the past. One morning, as the first snow dusted the valley, Marcus found Shadow Dancer's herd sheltering in a grove of trees. Near the rehabilitation center, the stallion stood alert, watching over his family with the same quiet strength that had inspired so many. A group of children from the environmental education program had come to observe the horses, their eyes wide with wonder. Among them was Richard Kane's granddaughter Emma, who had inherited her Uncle Thomas's love for wildlife rather than her grandfather's drive for development. "Is it true?" Emma asked Marcus. "Did Shadow Dancer really remember you helped him, and that's why he brought all the horses here when they were in trouble?" Marcus smiled, watching the majestic stallion guide his herd through the snowy landscape. "Sometimes," he replied, "the greatest gift we can give is simply showing kindness when it's needed most. Everything else follows from that." The snow continued to fall as they watched the wild horses move through their protected homeland. Shadow Dancer's story had become legend in Silver Creek Valley, but its true power lay not in the past, but in the future it had helped create, a future where people and nature could thrive together, where ancient wisdom and modern knowledge could blend, where the wild spirit could run free. Sarah joined them, carrying supplies for the rehabilitation center's newest residents. "You know," she said, watching Shadow Dancer disappear into the snowy distance, "when you first pulled him from that mud pit, I thought we were just saving one horse, but we were really saving ourselves, our connection to the land, to each other, to something wild and precious that lives in all of us." As if in response, Shadow Dancer's powerful neigh echoed across the valley, a reminder that some voices could never be silenced, some spirits could never be broken, and some bonds, once formed, would endure forever in the heart of Silver Creek Valley. Spring arrived in Silver Creek Valley with an unprecedented flourish of new life. The protected corridors that Shadow Dancer had helped establish had created a ripple effect throughout the ecosystem. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in brilliant colors, drawing butterflies and birds in numbers not seen in decades. The rehabilitation center buzzed with activity as nature's renewal brought new challenges and opportunities. One crisp morning, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. A sleek black car pulled up to the farmhouse, and out stepped Alexandra Rivers, a renowned wildlife photographer whose work had helped document and protect endangered species worldwide. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, extending her hand. I've come about Shadow Dancer. His story has reached far beyond your valley, and I believe it could help protect wild horses everywhere." Alexandra's arrival coincided with a remarkable event. Shadow Dancer's herd had grown to include horses from multiple family groups, creating one of the largest wild herds in the region. More significantly, they had begun exhibiting behavior that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about wild horse social structures. "They're adapting," Dr. Rodriguez explained, as they watched the herd through high-powered lenses. "Instead of competing for resources, they're cooperating. Different family groups are working together in ways we've never documented before." The presence of Alexandra's cameras captured extraordinary moments. Shadow Dancer had developed a unique method of leading his expanded herd, using different calls to communicate different messages. Young foals from various family groups played together, while older horses stood guard, sharing responsibilities in a complex social network. But the most remarkable discovery came from an unexpected source. Emma Kane, now 12 and a regular volunteer at the rehabilitation center, noticed something while reviewing Alexandra's footage. "Look," she pointed to the screen. "Shadow Dancer isn't just leading them, he's teaching them." The footage showed the stallion deliberately demonstrating safe paths through difficult terrain to younger horses, showing them where to find water during dry spells and how to navigate the changing landscape. This level of intentional knowledge transfer had never been documented in wild horses before. The discovery sparked a new wave of research interest in Silver Creek Valley. Scientists arrived from universities across the country, eager to study how the protection of wild spaces had allowed natural behaviors to flourish in ways they hadn't thought possible. Sarah's rehabilitation techniques gained new validation as researchers observed how successfully released animals integrated back into wild populations. The combination of modern veterinary care and Mary Blackhawk's traditional wisdom had created a model that other wildlife centers began to emulate. Thomas Kane's environmental leadership program had expanded to include students from around the world. Young people came to learn not just about conservation, but about the power of community action and the importance of standing up for what they believed in. Shadow Dancer showed us that survival isn't just about being the strongest, Thomas told his students. It's about adapting, cooperating, and sometimes knowing when to trust those who want to help. The valley's transformation had caught the attention of policymakers. A delegation of state and federal officials arrived to study how the community had managed to balance conservation with economic development. What they found challenged conventional wisdom about the supposed conflict between environmental protection and progress. Local businesses were thriving, thanks to sustainable tourism and the innovative farming practices developed by the cooperative. The Rehabilitation Center had created jobs while preserving wildlife. Even Richard Kane had begun to see the economic potential in preservation rather than exploitation. One afternoon, as Alexandra set up her cameras to capture the sunset, Shadow Dancer led his herd to the ridge overlooking the valley. The sight of wild horses silhouetted against the golden sky drew gasps from observers, but Marcus noticed something else. The stallion's keen awareness of the cameras. "He knows we're documenting him," Alexandra said softly. "These animals are far more intelligent and aware than we've given them credit for." The footage Alexandra captured would indeed help protect wild horses beyond Silver Creek Valley. Her documentary, Shadow Dancer, Spirit of the Wild, became a catalyst for conservation efforts across the American West. But more importantly, it showed how one community's choice to stand for preservation over profit had created a model for positive change. The Rehabilitation Center continued to evolve. James Cooper's veteran program had expanded to include families dealing with trauma, proving that the healing power of working with animals extended far beyond individual recovery. The sight of wounded warriors finding peace alongside injured wildlife became a powerful symbol of renewal. Mary Blackhawk's influence grew as more people recognized the value of traditional ecological knowledge. She began training a new generation of wildlife specialists who would combine ancient wisdom with modern science, ensuring that both ways of knowing would inform future conservation efforts. "The old ones taught us," she would say, watching Shadow. Dancers heard move across their protected homeland, that when we heal the land, we heal ourselves. When we protect the wild spirit, we protect our own hearts. The spring brought another unexpected development. A group of corporate leaders, inspired by Thomas Kane's example, established a fund to support similar conservation initiatives in other communities. The Silver Creek model began to spread, showing how environmental protection could coexist with thoughtful development. Emma Kane's involvement with the Rehabilitation Center had inspired other young people to become active in conservation. She started a youth wildlife observation program, teaching her peers how to document and protect the valley's diverse species. Shadow Dancer taught us that freedom isn't just about running wild, Emma told her young students. It's about having the wisdom to know when to lead and when to follow, when to fight and when to trust. As Alexandra's cameras captured the daily life of the valley, they recorded countless small miracles. Injured animals returning to the wild, divided communities finding common ground, young people discovering their power to make positive change. But perhaps the most powerful images were of Shadow Dancer himself, now a mature leader whose presence commanded respect from humans and animals alike. One memorable sequence showed the stallion guiding a young injured foal to the rehabilitation center, seemingly understanding that here help could be found. The footage demonstrated what Marcus had known since that first rainy night, that animals possessed intelligence and emotional complexity far beyond what most humans recognized. The success of Silver Creek Valley's transformation began to influence policy at higher levels. Legislators studying their model recognized that environmental protection didn't have to come at the expense of economic growth. The valley had proven that preservation could be a path to prosperity. Sarah's work with wildlife rehabilitation continued to break new ground. Her studies of how shadow dancers herd, communicated, and cooperated led to new insights into animal behavior and intelligence. The Rehabilitation Center became a leading institution for both healing and research. As spring progressed, the valley witnessed another remarkable event. Shadow dancers' expanded herd began teaching their protective behaviors to other wild horse groups. The adaptation that had started with one injured stallion was spreading naturally through the population, creating more resilient and cooperative wild herds. This is evolution in action, Dr. Rodriguez explained to a group of visiting scientists. Not just physical adaptation, but social and behavioral evolution. These horses are showing us how nature responds to protection and respect instead of exploitation and control. Alexandra's cameras captured it all, the daily triumphs and challenges, the moments of connection between humans and animals, the slow but steady healing of both the land and its inhabitants. Her work would help ensure that the lessons of Silver Creek Valley would reach and inspire others around the world. As the spring sunshine warmed the valley, Marcus stood with Sarah and Mary Blackhawk, watching Shadow Dancer lead his herd through their evening grazing routine. The stallion's presence remained as powerful as ever, but there was also a gentleness to him now, a wisdom that seemed to grow with each passing season. "He's showing us the way," Mary said softly, "just as he always has, the way to balance freedom with responsibility, strength with compassion, progress with preservation." The legacy of that stormy night, when Marcus had first found Shadow Dancer, continued to grow, touching more lives and inspiring more positive change than anyone could have imagined. In saving one horse, they had started a movement that would ensure the wild spirit of Silver Creek Valley would endure for generations to come. The summer sun blazed over Silver Creek Valley as Marcus and Sarah stood before a gathering of international conservation leaders. The Rehabilitation Center had been chosen to host the first Global Wildlife Protection Summit, bringing together experts and advocates from around the world. The choice of venue was no accident. Silver Creek Valley had become a living testament to what was possible when communities chose to protect rather than exploit their natural heritage. Alexandra Rivers' documentary about Shadow Dancer had premiered at major film festivals, winning awards and capturing hearts worldwide. But more importantly, It had sparked a movement. Communities across the globe were reaching out, eager to learn how they could replicate Silver Creek Valley's success. The key, Marcus explained to the assembled delegates, isn't just about saving animals. It's about recognizing that when we protect the wild spirit, we protect something essential in ourselves. As if to underscore his words, a familiar sound drew everyone's attention. Shadow Dancer appeared on the ridge above the center, leading his herd in their morning migration. The sight of wild horses moving freely across protected land provided a powerful backdrop to the summit's discussions. The gathering had drawn an unexpected participant, Richard Kane himself. The former adversary had undergone his own transformation, influenced by his son's passion and his granddaughter's dedication to wildlife conservation. He stood now, addressing the group with surprising humility. "I spent years measuring success in dollars and cents," he admitted. "But watching what's happened here, seeing how preservation has created more value than exploitation ever could, has taught me that true wealth isn't always counted in money." The summit brought new opportunities and challenges. A team of international researchers proposed establishing a network of wildlife corridors connecting protected areas across state lines. The Silver Creek model would serve as the blueprint, with Shadow Dancer's herd demonstrating how wild populations could thrive when given sufficient space and protection. Dr. Rodriguez presented her latest findings, documenting how the valley's ecosystem had flourished since the establishment of the protected corridors. Species thought to have abandoned the area were returning, creating a renaissance of biodiversity that exceeded all expectations. Emma Kane, now recognized as a young leader in wildlife conservation, led summit participants on tours of the rehabilitation center. Her understanding of both the scientific and emotional aspects of their work impressed even the most experienced conservationists. "We're not just saving individual animals," she explained, showing visitors the recovery areas where injured wildlife found healing. "We're preserving the connections between all living things, the web of life that makes our world whole." The summit coincided with another significant moment in the valley's history. The cooperative farming network, under Jack Wheeler's leadership, had developed new, sustainable agriculture techniques that allowed farming to coexist harmoniously with wildlife. Their methods were being studied and adopted by communities around the world. Mary Blackhawk's traditional knowledge played a crucial role in these developments. Her understanding of how the land had supported both human and animal populations for generations provided insights that modern science was only beginning to grasp. "Our ancestors knew," she told the gathered experts, "that wealth flows from balance, not dominance. When we protect the wild, we protect our future." James Cooper's veteran rehabilitation program had expanded into an international network, bringing former soldiers from around the world to find healing through work with wildlife. The sight of warriors turned healers working alongside wild creatures became a powerful symbol of transformation, but perhaps the most remarkable development came from Shadow Dancer himself. The stallion's herd had become a living laboratory for understanding wild horse behavior. Their complex social structures and cooperative strategies challenged everything scientists thought they knew about these magnificent animals. Alexandra's cameras captured a particularly moving scene. Shadow Dancer, teaching young horses from different family groups how to work together during a mountain lion encounter. Instead of panic or flight, the herd demonstrated coordinated defensive behavior that kept every member safe. "This isn't just instinct," Dr. Rodriguez explained to the amazed observers. "This is learned behavior being passed down through generations. These horses are creating culture." The summit's discussions ranged far beyond wildlife conservation. Communities facing similar challenges sought advice on how to balance development with preservation, how to build consensus among diverse stakeholders, how to turn potential adversaries into allies. Thomas Kaine's environmental leadership program had become a model for youth engagement in conservation. Young people from around the world came to learn not just about protecting wildlife, but about building the kind of community that made protection possible. "The most important lesson we teach," Thomas told the summit participants, "is that change begins with individual choices. Every person who chooses to stand for something larger than themselves becomes part of the solution." As the summit progressed, Silver Creek Valley's transformation continued to inspire. Local businesses presented new models of sustainable tourism. The Rehabilitation Center showcased innovative healing techniques. The cooperative farms demonstrated how agriculture could support both human and wildlife populations. Sarah's veterinary protocols, combining modern medicine with traditional healing practices, drew particular interest. Her success in rehabilitating injured wildlife while preserving their wild nature had created a new standard in wildlife care. "The goal isn't to tame," she explained, leading a workshop on rehabilitation techniques. "It's to heal while respecting the wild spirit that makes these creatures who they are." One evening, as the summit participants gathered for a sunset observation session, Shadow Dancer led his herd closer than usual to the center. The stallion's presence seemed deliberate, as if he understood the importance of what was happening. There, Alexandra's cameras rolled as the wild horses moved with fluid grace through the golden light. The footage would become part of a new documentary series, showing how the protection of one valley could inspire global change. "Look at how they move," Emma pointed out to the gathered observers. "Each horse knows its role, its place in the family, but they're also constantly adapting, learning, growing, just like we need to do." The summit's final day brought an announcement that would secure Silver Creek Valley's legacy. An international coalition of conservation organizations, inspired by their success, had created a fund to support similar initiatives worldwide. The Silver Creek model would be replicated in other communities, creating a network of protected wild spaces. Richard Kaine, in a gesture that surprised everyone, announced his company's commitment to the fund. "My granddaughter helped me see," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that the greatest legacy we can leave isn't in what we build, but in what we protect." As the summit drew to a close, Marcus found himself standing with Sarah and Mary Blackhawk at the spot where he had first found Shadow Dancer trapped in the mud. The valley had changed so much since that night, yet its essential character, its wild spirit, remained intact. "One act of kindness," Mary observed, watching Shadow Dancer's herd move across the protected land, "can ripple out to touch the whole world. You saved more than a horse that night, Marcus. You helped save something precious in all of us." The legacy of Silver Creek Valley would continue to grow, inspiring communities around the world to find their own balance between progress and preservation, between human needs and wildlife protection. Shadow Dancer's story had become more than just a tale of rescue and recovery. It had become a blueprint for hope, showing how humanity could choose a different path forward, one that honored and protected the wild spirit in all living things. Winter descended on Silver Creek Valley with unexpected ferocity. Climate change had brought extreme weather patterns that tested both wildlife and human residents. But the community that had formed around Shadow Dancer's legacy faced this new challenge with the same spirit of innovation and cooperation that had defined their conservation efforts. Marcus stood at his farmhouse window, watching the heavy snow blanket the landscape. The rehabilitation center had been transformed into an emergency shelter, not just for injured wildlife, but for entire herds seeking refuge from the brutal storm. Sarah and her team worked tirelessly, their experience with Shadow Dancer having taught them how to help wild animals without diminishing their essential nature. "Look at this!" Sarah called out, pointing through the observation window. Shadow Dancer's herd had taken shelter in the protected valley below the center, but what amazed observers was how they were sharing the space with other herds. The stallion's legendary leadership had evolved into something extraordinary. He was teaching other herds how to survive the harsh conditions. Emma Kane, now heading the Youth Conservation Program, documented the unprecedented behavior. "They're sharing resources," she explained to a group of visiting researchers. "Different herds taking turns accessing the sheltered areas, coordinating their movements to conserve energy. We've never seen this level of inter-herd cooperation before." The severe weather had brought unexpected allies. Richard Kane's development company, once focused solely on profit, had redirected its resources to help construct emergency wildlife shelters throughout the valley. The same equipment that had once threatened to destroy wild habitats was now being used to protect them. Sometimes the tools of destruction can become instruments of preservation, Richard observed, watching his construction crews work alongside conservation volunteers. It's all in how you choose to use them. Mary Blackhawk's traditional knowledge proved invaluable during the crisis. Her understanding of how native peoples and wildlife had survived extreme winters for generations helped guide their response. The combination of ancient wisdom and modern technology created solutions that neither approach could have achieved alone. "Our ancestors knew," she told the gathered community, "that survival depends on cooperation, not competition." The wild ones remember this truth. It's time for us to remember it too. The winter crisis sparked new innovations at the rehabilitation center. Sarah and her team developed portable emergency shelters that could be quickly deployed wherever they were needed. The designs incorporated both modern materials and traditional knowledge about how animals naturally sought protection from the elements. James Cooper's veteran program took on new significance during the crisis. The discipline and resourcefulness of former soldiers proved crucial in organizing emergency response teams. Their experience with trauma helped them understand how to approach stressed wildlife without causing additional fear. "In war, we learned how to destroy," James told his team. "Here, we're learning how to protect and preserve. It's a different kind of strength, but it's the kind the world needs now." Alexandra Rivers returned to document this new chapter in Silver Creek Valley's story. Her cameras captured remarkable scenes of humans and animals working together to survive the harsh conditions. Shadow Dancer's herd became the centerpiece of her new documentary, showing how wild creatures could adapt and help others adapt to changing conditions. This isn't just about survival. Alexandra explained during a filming break. It's about evolution, not just physical adaptation, but the evolution of behavior, of cooperation, of consciousness itself. The winter crisis brought an unexpected opportunity for Thomas Kaine's environmental leadership program. Young people from around the world came to study how the community was handling the challenges of climate change while protecting its wildlife. The program expanded to include practical training in emergency response and wildlife protection. We're not just teaching conservation anymore, Thomas told his students. We're teaching resilience, how communities can adapt to change while preserving what's most precious. Dr. Rodriguez's research team made groundbreaking discoveries. During this period, the extreme conditions revealed new aspects of wild horse behavior that had never been documented before. Shadow Dancer's herd demonstrated sophisticated problem-solving abilities, including creating windbreaks for weaker members and clearing snow to access frozen grass. What we're seeing, Dr. Rodriguez reported to the scientific community, is the emergence of new social structures in response to environmental stress. These horses aren't just surviving, they're innovating. The cooperative farming network, under Jack Wheeler's leadership, opened their barns and pastures to wildlife seeking shelter. The same farmers who had once seen wild horses as competitors for grazing land now worked to protect them, understanding that the health of the land depended on maintaining its natural balance. Emma's youth observation teams documented everything, creating a valuable record of how wildlife adapted to extreme conditions. Their data would help other communities prepare for similar challenges as climate change affected wild populations worldwide. Each crisis teaches us something new, Emma explained to her young volunteers. The key is to learn from both success and failure, to adapt our methods while staying true to our core mission of protection. The Rehabilitation Center's success in handling the crisis attracted attention from international conservation organizations. Their methods for helping wildlife through extreme weather events while maintaining their wild nature became a model for other facilities around the world. Sarah's innovative medical protocols, developed through years of working with injured wild animals, proved especially valuable during the crisis. Her techniques for treating cold-stressed wildlife while minimizing human contact helped maintain the delicate balance between assistance and independence. The goal isn't to make them dependent on us, she explained to visiting veterinarians. It's to help them maintain their strength and wildness even when they need our help to survive. Mary Blackhawk worked with the community to establish a network of traditional shelter sites, places where the landscape naturally provided protection from harsh weather. These sites, known to indigenous peoples for generations, became crucial havens for wildlife during the worst of the storm. The land remembers, she would say, showing others how to recognize these natural sanctuaries. It has always provided for its children. We just need to remember how to read its signs. As the winter progressed, Shadow Dancer's influence continued to grow. His herd's successful adaptation to the extreme conditions inspired other wild populations. The stallion's leadership style, combining strength with cooperation, became a subject of study for both wildlife experts and community leaders. Richard Kaine, watching the success of their combined efforts, found himself deeply moved by the transformation he had witnessed, both in the valley and in himself. "I used to think power meant control," he confided to Marcus one evening. "Now I understand that true power lies in protection, in preserving something greater than ourselves. The winter crisis had tested Silver Creek Valley's commitment to wildlife protection, but it had also revealed the strength of their approach. The community had shown that when humans chose to work with nature rather than against it, remarkable things were possible. Alexandra's cameras captured the moment when the first signs of spring began to appear. Shadow Dancer led his herd out of the sheltered valley, their survival through the harsh winter a testament to the power of adaptation and cooperation. The sight of wild horses moving freely across the snow-melt-fed landscape became a symbol of hope for communities facing similar challenges. This valley has taught us, Marcus reflected, watching the herd move across their protected homeland, that every crisis carries within it the seeds of transformation. The key is choosing how we respond, with fear and control, or with courage and compassion. The legacy of that first rescue, when Marcus had pulled Shadow Dancer from the mud, had grown into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It had shown how one act of kindness could spark a movement, how one community's choice to protect rather than exploit could inspire global change. As winter's grip began to loosen, Silver Creek Valley emerged stronger, its commitment to preserving the wild spirit deeper than ever. The crisis had proved that their model of conservation, based on cooperation between humans and nature, could withstand even the most extreme challenges. The story of Shadow Dancer and Silver Creek Valley continued to evolve, inspiring communities around the world to find their own path to balance between human needs and wildlife protection. It remained a testament to the power of choosing compassion over control, preservation over profit, and hope over fear. 5 years had passed since that stormy night when Marcus Thompson found Shadow Dancer trapped in the mud. The transformation of Silver Creek Valley had exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. What began as one man's act of compassion had blossomed into a movement that redefined the relationship between humans and wildlife. Marcus stood at the observation deck of the newly expanded rehabilitation center, now an international hub for wildlife conservation and research. The facility had grown far beyond its humble beginnings, but its heart remained true to the principles that Shadow Dancer's story had taught them, that healing happened best when nature's wild spirit was respected and preserved. Sarah approached, carrying the latest research data from their groundbreaking studies. "You need to see this," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "The satellite tracking shows that Shadow Dancer's influence has spread far beyond our valley. Wild horse. Herds across 3 states are adopting the cooperative behaviors his herd pioneered." The evidence was remarkable. What had started as one herd's adaptation to extreme conditions had evolved into a broader transformation of wild horse society. The sophisticated social structures and problem-solving behaviors first observed in Shadow Dancer's herd were being passed from group to group, creating more resilient wild populations. Emma Kane, now a respected wildlife biologist in her own right, had documented this phenomenon in her doctoral thesis. "It's not just mimicry," she explained to a group of international researchers. "These horses are actively teaching each other new survival strategies. They're creating a new cultural paradigm for their species." The valley itself had become a living laboratory for studying how wildlife and human communities could thrive together. The cooperative farming network had expanded into a model of sustainable agriculture that was being replicated worldwide. Local businesses had discovered that preservation could be more profitable than exploitation. Richard Kane's transformation had perhaps been the most dramatic. The former developer had become one of the most powerful advocates for wildlife protection in the region. His business acumen, once focused on profit at any cost, now drove initiatives that proved conservation and commerce could coexist. "I spent years fighting against nature," Richard told a gathering of corporate leaders. "Now I understand that true prosperity comes from working with it. The wild spirit we tried to control was actually showing us the way forward." The rehabilitation center's innovative programs continued to evolve. James Cooper's work with veterans had expanded into a comprehensive healing program that served people from all walks of life. The connection between human and animal healing had proven more powerful than anyone had imagined. "Every wounded creature that finds healing here," James observed, watching a group of veterans working with injured wildlife, "helps heal something in us, too. The wild spirit knows no boundaries between species." This Mary Blackhawk's integration of traditional wisdom with modern conservation practices had created a new paradigm for environmental protection. Young scientists and indigenous knowledge keepers worked side by side, learning from each other and from the land itself. "The circle is complete," Mary said, as she guided a group through the valley's sacred sites. "The old ways and the new have found harmony, just as the wild and human worlds have found balance." Alexandra Rivers' documentaries about Silver Creek Valley had sparked a global movement. Communities around the world were discovering that protecting wildlife could revitalize their economies and restore their connection to the land. The Silver Creek model had become a blueprint for positive change. Thomas Kane's environmental leadership program had grown into an international network of young activists and innovators. His students were developing new solutions to conservation challenges, proving that the next generation could build bridges where their parents had built walls. "Shadow Dancer taught us," Thomas told his graduating class, "that leadership isn't about dominance. It's about showing others the way to something better. Each of you carries that lesson forward." Dr. Rodriguez's research had revolutionized our understanding of wild horse intelligence and social behavior. The sophisticated strategies observed in Shadow Dancer's herd had challenged conventional wisdom about animal consciousness and adaptation. "We're not just observing survival," she explained in her keynote address at an international conservation conference. "We're witnessing the evolution of consciousness itself, the emergence of new ways of being that bridge the gap between wild and wise." The valley's protected corridors had created a network of wildness that allowed natural processes to flourish. Species thought lost to the region had returned. Ancient migration routes had reopened. The land itself seemed to be healing, returning to a balance that had been lost. Jack Wheeler's cooperative farming network had discovered that working with natural processes could be more productive than fighting against them. Their methods proved that human needs and wildlife protection could support rather than compete with each other. "The land knows what it needs," Jack would say, showing visitors their sustainable practices. "Our job is to listen and learn, not dictate and demand." Emma's youth conservation programs had created a new generation of environmental stewards. Young people who grew up understanding the value of wildness were becoming leaders in their own communities, spreading the message of preservation and protection. Every child who learns to see the wild spirit, Emma told a gathering of educators, becomes a guardian of something precious. They're not just protecting animals, they're protecting the future itself. The rehabilitation center had become a place of transformation for both animals and humans. Injured wildlife found healing without losing their essential nature. People discovered that helping others could heal something in themselves. Sarah's veterinary protocols had created a new standard for wildlife care. Her methods, which respected the wild spirit while providing necessary medical treatment, had been adopted by rehabilitation centers around the world. The key, she explained to visiting veterinarians, is remembering that we're not here to control nature, but to support its healing power. The wild spirit knows what it needs, we just have to listen. Alexandra's cameras had captured the valley's transformation over the years, creating a visual record of what was possible when communities chose protection over exploitation. Her work continued to inspire others to find their own path to balance with nature. As Marcus watched Shadow Dancer's herd move across the protected landscape, he reflected on how far they had come. The stallion's coat had silvered with age, but his presence remained as powerful as ever. He had become more than just a leader of his herd. He was a symbol of the wild spirit that lived in all things. "Look at him," Sarah said softly, joining Marcus at the observation deck. "He's not just surviving anymore, he's showing us all how to thrive." The legacy of that stormy night when Marcus first found Shadow Dancer continued to grow. The story of one man's compassion for an injured horse had sparked a movement that was changing how humans related to the natural world. It showed that when people chose to protect rather than exploit, to cooperate rather than control, remarkable transformations were possible. Silver Creek Valley had become more than just a success story in conservation. It was a living example of how communities could thrive by preserving the wild spirit that gave life its deepest meaning. The journey that began with saving one horse had led to saving something precious in all of us. The understanding that true wealth lay not in what we could take from nature, but in what we chose to protect and preserve. As the sun set over the valley, Shadow Dancer led his herd in their evening grazing routine. The sight of wild horses moving freely across protected land remained a powerful reminder of what was possible when people chose to stand for something larger than themselves. Their story had become a testament to the enduring power of compassion, courage, and the wild spirit that connected all living things. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.